We will build a great wall along the southern border, and Mexico will pay for the wall.
Yo no voy a pagar ese muro. Yo no voy a pagar ese muro.
Yo no voy a pagar ese muro.
Yo no pago.
No.
No voy a pagar ese muro porque yo soy ese muro.
Yo también soy el muro.
Yo también soy ese muro.
Yo también soy el muro.
Frente a la invasión migratoria centroamericana,
Somos el muro.
de Chiapas a Sonora,
Somos el muro.
del Caribe hasta el Pacífico,
Somos el muro.
no somos Honduras, no somos Guatemala, no somos El Salvador. Somos parte de América del Norte y estamos aptos de vivir como si no lo fuéramos. Cada país tiene un rol en el mundo y nosotros sabemos muy bien cuál es el nuestro.
Somos el muro.
Hay muchas maneras de ser el muro.
Yo no les ayudo, porque como vienen huyendo de su violencia, pues se supone que pueden pedir refugio y quedarse.
Yo no les doy trabajo.
Yo llamo a la policía. Se supone que no se los deben de llevar, pero igual se los llevan.
Si les doy, les pago la mitad.
No nos damos abasto con servicios y medicinas para nosotros. Menos se los voy a dar a ellos.
Te roban al marido, sobre todo las hondureñas. Lo amarran con un hijo y ya, se naturalizaron. Míralas.
No, yo sí les vendo, pero les cuido las manos.
Si puedo, les cobro el triple.
Yo corro la voz de que son una plaga.
Yo no hago nada.
No importa, al no hacer nada también eres parte del muro. ¿Qué parte del muro eres tú? ¿Qué parte del muro eres tú? Eres tú. ¿Qué parte del sueño americano? El alma del muro eres tú. Eres tú. Así, así. Eres tú.
Somos el muro. Somos la carne, cemento y calma el futuro. We are the wall. We are the future. We are the ones who are the flesh and blood of infrastructure. Eres tú, el que cierra la frontera. Eres tú, el muro que no cruzará.
Hello, and welcome to the final lecture week of Introduction to Visual Art. This week we are talking about activism in art, and we also are talking about controversial art. So, follow along. I hope you have opinions on the art that we see, but think about it a little bit. This art isn't necessarily easy to handle. Some of it's quite confusing or complicated, but I think you'll enjoy seeing these examples of activist art and also controversial art. So that video we just saw played as a commercial on television in Mexico, particularly in Tijuana, which is across the Mexican border from San Diego, California. It also played in, I want to say, Brownsville, Texas area, and it played in Mexico City. It is supposed to be funny, and I think it is funny in a lot of ways. It is certainly, along the realm of fake news. But it was put together by these artists called the Yes Men. And we'll be looking at 2 more videos by the Yes Men during this presentation. The Yes Men are activists and they are pranksters. And a lot of what they do is controversial. So, by airing that video that we saw, the Yes Men were creating something that was funny to them, funny to even Mexicans when in the markets where they were playing them. It was seen as a satirical video and act. Interesting, though, is that video gained traction in places such as Guatemala. And the Guatemalan government was furious with the Yes Men and with Mexican sort of television because they were taking this wall idea, we are the wall, very seriously. And by the government taking that concept seriously, they didn't see it as a joke. Because Guatemalans apparently don't joke in such a way, it turned into a sort of political nightmare between Mexico and Guatemala. And I find it funny. I find it satirical. It's not. I can see how it's controversial, though. Hopefully you enjoy that. Again, this is the last week for our presentations. Next week is our finals week, and your final project is due. Remember, that is the Instagrammable art show. Check out the video from last week where I explain it, and look for the project handout. So moving on with activism in art. I want to show you this video by an artist named Jeremy Deller. He was a rather, he is a rather known conceptual artist in the UK. And this video that he made is called The Battle of Orgreave. And to put this into context, let's read about it. So in 1984, there was a strike, coal miners in the small town of Orgreave were striking against their industry, and 25 years later, he decided to revisit the confrontation that happened. In that strike, it got very violent, and the coal miners in this small town, this is the town, the coal miners were fighting the police, and the police were fighting the coal miners. People got severely injured, people died, and it was a national story in 1984 for the United Kingdom. And ultimately, the coal mine shut down. All the people in this small town lost their jobs, but it wasn't for lack of fighting. So what he did, Jeremy Deller, is he, 25 years later, decided to revisit that conflict, and he staged another a riot, like you know how there will be these, fake Civil War battles by the Civil War enthusiasts. He orchestrated this battle for video, but he also invited the people who were involved in the conflict to be part of the video. So when he asked them to participate, he asked the police to play the roles of the coal miners, and he asked the coal miners to play the roles of police. And so he made an interesting thing. Let's check out this clip. So as you see, there are these photos that are flashing up on the screen, and the idea was that he is doing a very literal, he's very literally like reenacting these images and media videos.
A whole change in social policy about benefits and
This guy's being interviewed, he's explaining it. And there's the Prime Minister at the time of the United Kingdom, that's Margaret Thatcher.
Has been able to carry on that way. Every government has accepted that we must carry on that way. Every previous National Union of Mine Workers had accepted it. So what we are saying is nothing fresh or new, but we must be able to carry on to secure a really...
So that's actual footage of the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and a lot of people really blamed her for the policies that led to the violence in this town and the coal mines closing down. So this is activism on a community scale which I find interesting. The artist recruited people from the town, and also he recruited people who were the coal miners and the police, and he got everybody involved to do this reenactment. The idea was to create a bit of catharsis about the incident and to bring the idea in the incident back to the forefront a little bit, because it was never really settled, and it had just gone 25 years with no one really talking about the incident. This is a project by a Chicago group. This is a project by a Chicago group called HaHa, H-A-H-A. They're a collective of artists that were interested in activism. And this is, I think, in this project called Flood, I think is an interesting project. A group of 20 to 30 people, initially organized by HaHa, built and maintained a hydroponic garden in a storefront on the north side of Chicago. Participants grew vegetables, kale, collards, mustard greens, Swiss chard, and therapeutic herbs for people with HIV. For several years, Flood provided bi-weekly meals, educational activities, meeting space, public events, and information on alternative therapies, HIV/AIDS services in Chicago, nutrition and horticulture, as well as a place to garden. Here's a picture of the storefront and picture inside. So what is important about the plants that they grew? They're very symbolically important. So these kale, collards, mustard greens, and Swiss shards, they are plants that really are known for soaking up heavy metals. So they have the ability to absorb lead or mercury or other metals from the ground when you plant them in the ground, and then they become part of the system, part of the leaves that you eat. Well, alternatively, there's this idea that that plants such as this, with the ability to absorb heavy metals, when you eat them, they should be able to take heavy metals out of your body and toxins out of your body. So this project from 1992 to 1995 was important because a lot of people were learning to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis. It's at that point, it's hit the entire country, it's hit the entire world, and there are these treatments that are being developed, but there at that time hadn't been really excellent treatments. That didn't happen until about 96, 97. So a lot of people were looking towards nutrition and eating a certain diet in order to control the effects of HIV/AIDS. So this was a community outreach center, and again, like the Battle of Orgreave, this is interesting because it is focusing on the community and bringing the community into the environment or into the project. What we're looking at isn't art to the extent that you can describe it as drawing or painting. It's more art that is a social practice, some might call. It's a socially responsible act. It's an action, really based in activism. This is another interesting thing. Can you figure out what's going on? This is by the Chicago artists Michael Rockowitz and Joe Haywood. They started creating these shelters that they called Parasite. And the idea is they are inflatable, and what's inflating them? This shelter is attached to the ventilation or the exhaust of a large building, of like a factory building. And so warm air from the factory blows out through a vent, goes through the tube, and inflates the structure. And so, of course, this is in response to homeless populations in Chicago, but and a lack of housing opportunities. And this might seem a little bit of a ridiculous idea, but it makes sense if you think about it. Being able to be like a parasite, sucking energy off of other buildings. I think it's pretty clever. Here is another video by the group The Yes Men. Again, they are these pranksters, activists, people who love to get corporations into trouble, but in each instance, they've recognized a wrong that the corporations are ignoring. In this video, we have something, it's called the Bhopal disaster, and it talks about when there was a company called Union Carbide that was, I think, based in Michigan, maybe, but they were chemical manufacturers and they operated around the world. And one day they had a factory in a large city in India called Bhopal. And that factory exploded. And lots of chemicals were released into the air. Lots of chemicals burned off and created noxious fumes and long-term cancer issues. And so that explosion ultimately was the end to the company Union Carbide. The company was then bought up Union Carbide was bought up and all its assets. Union Carbide went bankrupt, but all of its assets and essentially its business were purchased by another company that's still in operation called Dow Chemical, D-O-W. And Dow Chemical took the position that all of the tragedies or this explosion or all of the sins of Union Carbide were not Dow Chemical's problem. And so the people in India had never received reparations from Union Carbide. Instead, they decided to go bankrupt and sell the company. So no one got in trouble. And some of the people from Union Carbide even became employees of Dow Chemical. So this is to frame the video. And you'll watch this guy here. He is one of the people in Yes Men. And so we'll watch him go on to television, making a fool out of Dow Chemical.
And you're watching BBC World. Our main headlines. The world's worst industrial accident is being remembered in India today. It's 20 years since deadly gas leaked from the Union Carbide chemical plant in the city of Bhopal. At least 18,000 deaths are attributed to the leak, and many local people say the contamination has never been properly cleared up.
Yeah. Should I typically just look right into the camera? Okay.
The factory still exists here, and that's been a real problem for the people living here locally. I mean, the site, I've been to it, and it's full of toxic waste. People who are living in these houses, they've all got a story to tell about that day 20 years ago. Many of them lost members of their family, and they say that they're continuing to suffer because of the tragedy. And they're saying somebody needs to answer for this. Legally, what they're saying is they want to pursue the company to try and clean up the site. But whether the company will accept liability seems doubtful.
Well, joining us live from Paris now is Jude Finisterra. He's a spokesman for Dow Chemicals, which took over Union Carbide. Good morning to you. A day of commemoration in Bhopal. Do you now accept responsibility for what happened?
Steve, yes. Today is a great day for all of us at Dow, and I think for millions of people around the world as well. It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very, very happy to announce that for the first time, Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives, and to fully and swiftly remediate the Bhopal plant site. Now, when we acquired Union Carbide 3 years ago, we knew what we were getting, and it's worth $12 billion. $12 billion. We have resolved to liquidate Union Carbide, this nightmare for the world and this headache for Dow, and use the $12 billion to adequately compensate the victims.
Jude, that's good news that you have finally accepted responsibility. Some people would say too late. It's 3 years, almost 4 years on.
When we acquired Union Carbide, we did settle their liabilities in the United States immediately. And we are now, 3 years later, prepared to do the same in India. We should have done it 3 years ago. We are doing it now. And I would also like to say that this is no small matter, Steve. This is the first time in history that a publicly owned company of anything near the size of Dow has performed an action which is significantly against its bottom line simply because it's the right thing to do. And our shareholders may take a bit of a hit, Steve, but I think that if they're anything like me, they will be ecstatic to be part of such a historic occasion of doing right by those that we've wronged.
Just to reiterate what Jude Finisterra, the spokesman for Dow Chemicals, has just said, he says Dow Chemicals now fully accept responsibility for the events in Bhopal.
Great.
That's it? Great. Now, they wanted radio. I can tell you one thing. We're not going out of business. We will continue to make profit. We will simply make slightly less profit than normal. But we are doing the right thing. We're comparing here, though, the value of money to the value of human life, and there is no comparison.
So if we were to continue watching the video, let's see. I don't have what's next in the video. But if you were to continue watching the video, you'd see suddenly the BBC is like, wait, or the BBC being the radio and the television, saying, we just got in contact, or we were just contacted by the real Dow Chemical, and they're saying that everything you just said is a farce. And then this guy from the Yes Men gets accused of creating a false hope for the community in Bhopal of the people that were affected, and on and on and on. And ultimately, those people, they don't get any money from Dow Chemical, but they do get back into the news cycle, at least for a moment. They embarrass Dow Chemical for at least a moment. It's definitely controversial, but I think rather an interesting way to approach this activism in art. I want to show you this other video by the Yes Men where they fraudulently print a New York Times newspaper and distribute it. These are the two guys from the Yes Men. So you remember that from the last that guy from the last video, and then this other one.
We needed a really ambitious plan, because all we ever read in the newspapers was how we needed to put everything back on track, back to how it was before it fell apart. But how it was the problem. We needed to show what real change could look like. So together with a whole lot of friends, we would blanket Manhattan with 100,000 copies of our very own newspaper. We'd call it the New York Times. Except our New York Times would be a little bit different. Ours would be set 6 months in the future. It would show what could happen if we set our imagination free.
Things have gotten pretty bad, and I think it's hard for people to imagine the world working another way. So we're trying to, as realistically as possible, present this world as it could be. They just wrote out the proofs of the New York Times, and it looks unfucking believable. Really good.
The obvious question, how the heck did you do it? And you want to start? How long were you working on this thing, and how many of you?
Well, there were a lot of us. It wasn't just the Yes Men. It was a large group of people. We were just one of many groups. It was an idea that sparked a lot of people's imaginations. They wanted to see this happen. And that's sort of the message of the paper as well, is that, great, we elected Obama, and that's fantastic, but now the real work begins.
The idea was to put out something that was optimistic, that says, we can do all these things. Why not? We created the system that we have now, so why not create a good one instead?
Wow, very good. This is the big day. 7 a.m. rush hour. This is the time to get the papers out there.
Free New York Times.
Special issue. Special issue.
Free New York Times. New York Times. Free New York Times. Is this real?
Fake, right?
Who publishes this? Can I grab another one, please? What? National Health Insurance Act passes.
The Patriot Act repealed.
Maximum wage law succeeds. Good luck with that.
It's too good to be true. But it's not impossible.
It's a dream newspaper, right? It's like you wake up and all the things that you wanted became the news.
The world over!
Fake news was a hit. But would the real news pick it up?
You don't work for the New York Times. Who is it that you work for handing this out?
A guy named John Smith? Yeah, John Smith.
John Smith.
The New York Times Special Edition. Is there anything wrong with it? I mean,
Yeah, but it's not the New York Times.
Extra, extra, read all about it. The New York Times declares the war in Iraq is over.
Some commuters got their hands on what looks like a special edition of the New York Times. As you might have guessed, though, it's a fake.
Eine New York Times in die Hand gedrückt bekamen, trauten jedenfalls ihren Augen nicht.
Джордж Буш отдан под суд, когда Литарес приносит официальное извинение. We printed a paper with the headlines that we'd like to see. So if these are the headlines that people were so excited to read this morning, let's make them happen.
I think it's gonna we have to exercise some muscles we either don't have or that have atrophied or something. A civic muscle, a thrifty muscle, a generous muscle.
We've got to take back our government. March into City Hall and say, here, we've got the solution.
We can think of the different ways that we can contribute to a movement that says business as usual is unacceptable because people are being hurt and we're not going to play the role, the subservient routine.
So, I mean, this is what it looks like. The Yes Men, they printed a fake New York Times with everything that they wanted to see change in the world and distributed it. Did they get any policy change? No, I wouldn't say so. But it, I think, is interesting in an activist sort of way and a way to proliferate their ideas throughout the community. So a couple years ago, I was listening to, 4 years ago now, I was listening to the radio and they were talking about this guy in small town Pennsylvania, a place called Lebanon, Pennsylvania, who in one night had wheat pasted all of these posters and giant murals onto different walls in the town. And a couple things real fast looking at this image. What do we see? We see feet with toe tags, so that looks like a dead person. And then this word that says Willkommen in German, and then these birds and these patterns. What we're looking at is something that's done in the tradition of what's called Pennsylvania Dutch, which is not Dutch, it's rather German people who settled in Pennsylvania in the hills and in the mountains, like 200 years ago. And so this is the art that came with them. So it's an old German style. And so if you go into that part of the country, you see barns painted with such styles and a lot of imagery like this. All right. So hopefully that helps you understand the image. Let's read about it. Residents in the small town of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, awoke on Wednesday morning to discover that the town had been plastered overnight with Del Marcel's artwork. Cheerful images of flowers and birds, common motifs in the Pennsylvania Dutch folk art tradition, coexist alongside corpses and body bags. A pop art postcard beckons, greetings from Lebanon, PA. as cans of Narcan, a prescription drug used to block the effects of an overdose, flow freely like soda into the mouths of tortured-looking men. A police officer shakes hands with the county coroner, declaring a death certificate to be low priority as a dark hellscape looms in the background. So why did the artist Adam Del Marcel do this to his town, throw these posters up? You may not be aware, especially if you've lived all your life in Chicagoland, that small towns across the country, including in Pennsylvania, especially small towns, are being hit with an epidemic of heroin abuse and lots of people dying from heroin abuse. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and it's the same story. I've got a handful of classmates that I graduated with high school that have died from heroin overdose. It's really the story of small town America right now, just like in the big cities. But small towns don't have the hospitals and places to treat people like that. So this guy woke up one day and decided he had had enough, and he printed out all these posters, and in another morning just plastered the town with these posters. Here's the other one that they were mentioning in that writing. So again, a dead-looking dude or a guy who's overdosed drinking Narcan. And like it says, Narcan is something that a paramedic will give a person, and it instantly reverses the effects of overdose. All right, so there's all kinds of activist artwork out there, lots of super interesting stuff. But of course, we only have so much time. Those are things that I think are pretty easy to talk about, and I like having those conversations with students. Now I want to go into a short section that I'm calling Censorship and Controversial Art. I do want to give you a warning that this section shows nudity, and in some cases graphic nudity, and sex, and you may be upset by religious images, things like that. But being that we are in college, I think that we can talk about this in an academic way. I'll warn you before those images come up, as best I can. Alright, so starting off with our censorship in art. I believe when we were talking about frescoes many weeks ago, I showed you the altar wall by Michelangelo. And one of the things is that there are a lot of naked people, but not a lot of genitalia in this painting, in this fresco. When the fresco was first painted, everybody was bare naked. Everyone's crotches were showing. And the church was all good, no major issues until, mind you, this is the 1500s, until Michelangelo was nearly done with the painting, and there was a cardinal or some important guy came in, and he wasn't having it. And so he forced Michelangelo to go and paint over all of the genitalia on each of these figures. And so all like what you see here and here. They're just these random pieces of fabric and cloth. Those are all afterthoughts. He was forced to put those on after this painting was made. Another example of controversial art. I wonder if you can figure out what's controversial about it. So in 1863, there had been a history of nudity in artwork. So you see this woman looking at you, or laying back. That's not the controversial part. This slave woman or servant presenting flowers to the white woman, that wasn't particularly controversial at the time. What was controversial is, of all things, that the white woman is looking at the viewer. The white woman has locked her eyes with you as you are looking at the painting. Up until this point, there weren't really images or paintings of nude people who were making eye contact with the viewer. Nude people had always been sort of in their own world, like we were looking into a world. But now, because that woman is looking at us directly, that means we are part of the world and that she is addressing us. So back in the day, in the 1800s, museums existed. They were a little different than they are now. Art galleries didn't really exist. But periodically, particularly famous artists such as Edouard Manet would have these paintings in public buildings or in the beginnings of art museums. And this is one of many instances in art history of art that was taken down from the wall because it was just too explicit to have the subject in the painting actually addressing you. All right, I want to move on to the next image, and if I remember right, the next image is a painting that is a little bit graphic. It shows some genitalia. So this painting was by a famous artist of his day, Gustave Courbet. It was painted, it was shown, and then popular culture got a little bit more conservative, and this painting disappeared. And for about 100 years, the whereabouts of this painting was unknown. And the truth of the matter is that it was taken down because it was seen as pornography. And the truth of the matter is that the people who owned it, or it was passed between, certain wealthy people as a pornographic image. All right, so here is a beautiful bronze sculpture called Bacchante and Infant Fawn. And this sculpture is on display in the Boston Art Museum. And it was originally installed, I believe, in that museum. The museum has always owned it. in the 1920s, maybe the 19 teens, this sculpture was taken out of the museum and it was hidden and it was put in storage. And why would that be? What is controversial about this? It doesn't necessarily have to do with the nudity. It has to do more with the character Bacchante and the baby in her arms. Bacchante was a Roman goddess, and she was the goddess of like wine, perhaps among other things. And so what you have is she's holding all of these grapes, and the baby in her arms, the baby wants those grapes more than anything else. And so what was happening in the 1900s and 19-teens? Around that time was something called the temperance movement in the United States. So the temperance movement was a group of people who were, it was a very large and influential group of people who were interested in making alcohol illegal. And so they are the ones that over a generation were able to actually make prohibition legal. And so the idea that this goddess was tempting an innocent child with alcohol was enough reason to make this sculpture disappear. So it went away, went into storage. Here's another interesting, controversial artwork. There are a few images. There and there. I don't love these artworks, but there's an interesting thing that happened where this artist named John Ahern, who was living in the Bronx in New York City, decided to start making sculptures that depicted the people in his neighborhood. People he would encounter every day. So here's a portrait of his neighbor, portrait of another neighbor, and another. These are all his neighbors. And he installed them on the street. He eventually installed them in this park. And he installed that guy in that same park. So what could possibly be controversial about this? You might be aware that the Bronx in New York City, just like in Brooklyn or Queens or even Manhattan, but Chicago, and I know this, I live in Chicago. The neighborhoods are very cliquey. There might be gangs that are specific to not even a neighborhood, but a block or 2 blocks or 3 city blocks. And those are specific, like a local gang's territory. And so what John Ahern wasn't thinking about when he was doing this is he started doing these sculptures of his neighbors, but one neighbor might live 2 blocks away and be affiliated with a different gang. And he might be depicting like 3 gangs or a gang member in a different territory. And that is true here. So this was a public space. and he's got all these affiliated gang members installed. And believe it or not, that sparked a lot of acute violence in the neighborhood. There were a lot of shootings and lots of confusion over territory and on and on. And so after being up for a very short time, all the artwork had to come down. It was funded by the city, but the city couldn't stand to have all this gang violence happening because of the artwork. So it came down. Here's another interesting artwork by an artist, Richard Serra. Richard Serra, I showed his art before when we were talking about metal construction or metal art. And so he likes to build these big steel structures, these big walls. This sculpture was installed in the courtyard of the Twin Towers. So the Twin Towers, they were standing in Lower Manhattan in 1981, and there was a courtyard that connected them. What was controversial about this is that everybody in those towers hated this artwork. Why did they hate the artwork? It's because the thing was like 80 feet long. And a lot of people had business in both towers. So they would be up on the 30th floor in one tower, and then they'd have to go to the other building. So they would go ride down the elevator, and then they'd have to walk around this 80-foot long barrier to the next tower and go up to the 28th floor. And every single person, even though this artwork was commissioned, every single person who was working in the Twin Towers hated it. They hated it so much that it was removed. They hated that they had to walk around it. And Richard Serra, he knew people were going to have to walk around it. He liked the idea because he felt that that way the public would, in a way, be really interacting with his art. The art became something for them to be aware of, like every day. But this went up in 1981 and it came down in 1981. This is one of those images that might be that's a little bit controversial religiously, religious-wise. I feel like some people might be upset by it. I think it is a beautiful photograph. And so what we're looking at is an artwork called Piss Christ, where the artist Andres Serrano had a little plastic crucifix, and he dropped it into a jar of urine and blood. And the idea wasn't necessarily to be controversial in his eyes. Maybe it was. I don't know. I think what he really wanted was to make an absolutely beautiful image. And I think you can argue that if you block out the title, Piss Christ, you could see how it is, the photo comes off as being something something, I don't know, almost religious. It's very beautiful. It seems nearly very godly, but then it's juxtaposed with the idea in your head that it is urine and blood. And inevitably, This is a famous artwork, and it's not installed always, but whenever it is installed, it is inevitably destroyed. So someone will go up to it, and they'll smash it. And that's what happened here. Okay, so I want to talk about an artist named Robert Mapplethorpe, who was a photographer, and he mounted an art show, and I believe it started at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the same museum that we have downtown Chicago, and it traveled around the country. In Chicago, there wasn't much incident, but then it went to New York, and it got a little bit of pushback, got to Washington, D.C., and major pushback, and eventually it made it to a museum in Cincinnati called the Contemporary Art Center, where police came in and they forcibly removed everybody from the museum, and they closed it. They closed down the show. Why? It's because the artwork is graphic in some cases. It's graphic sexuality, homosexuality. So a lot of people were perhaps put off by homosexual acts. Some of the images are kind of kinky, so meaning not only are they homosexual, but they are abnormal sexual acts. And then there were some photos of naked children. Now, the children, there was no sex involved, but people were like, but there's a naked child. You know, these images are like what your parents might keep of you in a scrapbook at home or a photo album. But they're these innocent photos, but they were next to photos of gay men having weird sex. And then there were also simply photos of flowers. So we had naked babies, gay men having sex, and pictures of flowers. So needless to say, the photos I'm going to show you are graphic. There are penises in the photos, but I'm going to go through them really fast. But I'm not going to dwell on any of them. But I will first show you a video, which is a preview for a movie called Mapplethorpe. And this movie preview gives you a good idea of the controversy and what his art was all about. So there's going to be a little bit of graphic photos in here, but they're not so bad.
Robert Mapplethorpe, who spent the last years of his life promoting homosexuality. Now, any senator who thinks that I'm attacking aesthetic art, if they have any doubt, and look at the pictures, look at the pictures, look at the pictures.
He loved to get a jolt out of people, a reaction. It was power. Just the way he dressed, the way he carried himself. The artist encompassed him.
I always was fascinated with the idea of taking sexuality and bringing it to a level that it hadn't been to before.
There was tension. My father wouldn't look at Robert. He was really not part of the family.
He was so busy being Robert Mapplethorpe to really care.
Everything was the means to an end to his career.
He was a new type of art.
The whole point of
being an artist is to learn about yourself. The photographs, I think, are less important than the life that one is leading.
So that's a preview for the movie, which I suggest watching if you are interested and have time, and if you can get your hands on it. And I have this other video that I'm not sure I want to watch, but it shows by the time it gets to Washington, D.C., it's got so much controversy that you have thousands of people filing in to see the show, and then these are a bunch of interviews afterwards. You can follow the link in the PDF if you want to watch this video. So, again, trigger warning, I am going to flash some of his images onto the screen. It'll take 5 seconds if you want to look somewhere else. That's the install. That's the artwork installed. And so there were all those images plus, these beautiful flower photographs that were mixed into it. I think that his artwork is, I think looking at one photo, the artwork may be rather vulgar, and I think that 2 photos, 3 photos, yeah, they're kind of vulgar, but then you get the flowers and you get just beautiful portraits of people that aren't really erotic at all. I think that he was demonized for showing a culture that people weren't interested in seeing, or how could the art world come to this? I don't think his art should be censored, whether I like the artwork or not, which a lot of the photos I really do like, even the ones that I call vulgar. But maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I do think that I do think it's a little bit much to forcibly close down the art show and protest art shows, especially ones that are showing a culture that is different than yours. In this case, a gay culture. This artwork was by an artist named Dred Scott Tyler in 1989. He went to school in downtown Chicago at a school called the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. You may or may not be aware that the art museum in downtown Chicago, called the Art Institute, has an art school affiliated with it, and it's in the same building as the museum. You just go in through the back doors and then you get into the school. And it's one of the premier art schools in the world. Let alone in the country and city. And so, in 1989, what Dred Scott did for his bachelor's degree art show, if you are going to art school and you are studying art, you're going to end your art career or your art school with having an art show, generally in the school's art gallery. And so we're seeing student work here. This guy was a senior in college, where he wrote a book, or had a book. I can't quite recall what's in the book. And then there's an image. But if you want to read the book, you have to walk onto this American flag that's on the floor, and then open the books and take a look. That caused such an uproar. You may agree or disagree with the idea of showing the American flag on the floor, or people walking on top of the American flag. I don't see it as much of an issue, but generally when I teach this class, we are face-to-face. It's not online. And I always get a handful of people that are so absolutely appalled that the American flag would be treated in such a way. And I get that. I understand. I lean more on the side of free speech, especially free speech when it comes to artwork, and that includes this project or the last Robert Mapplethorpe art show. I find it super interesting that it would be such an uproar, but you have to remember that, I guess, 31 years ago, our ideas on free speech were a little bit different. I mean, 30 years ago, you were not able to burn the American flag without getting arrested. Now, if you burn the American flag, it's considered free speech. And so things are changed. Times have changed a bit. This is a beautiful artwork by the artist Damien Hirst, where he did a series of these where he was producing these rose windows. Rose windows are the big stained glass windows that you'll see in cathedrals. But in this case, he was using butterflies. Lots and lots of butterflies. So what we're looking at are butterfly wings. It's a little grotesque if you see this artwork in person, but it's lovely just the same. And I'm sure you can see how this would be controversial. There have been many times in which, in this artwork and in some other artworks, that animal rights activists really protested the artwork of Damien Hirst in a major way. But all those protests only really serve to give more attention to the artist. Here's another one by Damien Hirst using butterfly wings. There's an artist that I got to tell you, when I heard about Santiago Sierra for the first time, I was absolutely appalled, because what he does is he creates, this isn't like often, a lot of times, he'll create menial tasks for people to do. And so he will pick up homeless people, or what's called day laborers, people who are looking for jobs for just a day, and they'll work for like $5 a day or whatever. And he'll bring them to an art museum or art gallery and say, I will pay you your wage if you stand here. And so it feels to me as though he's exploiting these poor folk. So what we have is just a big board or column or something that's sitting on a ledge there. And then you have two people for each column who have to stand here in order to keep the column up off the ground. Another instance, this piece is called Workers Who Cannot Be Paid, Remunerated to Remain Inside Cardboard Boxes. So workers cannot be paid. Remunerated means they are being paid. He is paying them to sit inside these boxes. So in an art gallery, he has migrant workers sitting on chairs, and then he takes these boxes and puts them over top of the workers. And those guys, they stay in there all day long. They don't say anything. They don't do anything. I'm sure they get a break. I don't know how. But they get paid to just sit there. Again, exploiting cheap labor or migrant or poor people. Another image of that. About 8 years ago now, there was a band, a punk band in Russia that I like to talk about called Pussy Riot. You may be aware of them, especially if you're into politics, into punk music. But this band was at a church in Moscow, and they decided to run onto the stage and do an impromptu concert. And you might get arrested for doing something like that in the United States. But the difference between Moscow and, Chicago is that this band was jailed for years, for like 3 years. And you wouldn't be jailed if you did that in the United States. So this is an instance where, music and sort of an act of protest against the government and the church really landed these people in a lot of hot water. They're since out, but that's because of pressure from the United States government and other governments around the world. And the last thing I'm going to show you is this artwork. Is it controversial? I don't know. Activist for sure. Where the artist Brett Bailey, like Santiago Sierra, hired these people to sit in windows in this art gallery. So he created these sort of settings to put on display the people who, in his mind, make the world go round. So he took this person who's like a maid or a cleaner, and pays her to sit there in the window as though it's a zoo. So this is called the human zoo. And from one window to another window to another window, you see these laborers on display for the public to view. So with controversial art, as in activist art, there's so much controversy out there, so much activism out there, and I simply don't have the time to really speak to the history and all the politics about all of the different controversial arts. But it's worth looking into. If you hear about something, pay attention to it. You might find it interesting. That's it for our final lecture. And after this, we'll watch the Art of the Day lecture, take the quiz, and then turn in your final assignment, which is the Instagrammable art show.